Welcome everybody. This is I think our fourth edition of our lockdown Hout Bay Food Growers chats. And today I've been asked by a few people to talk about planning a planting bed. And we thought a good way of referring to this in this situation at the moment is social distancing for plants. I think one of the things that people really get really confused about and maybe puts them off actually planting is all the different factors that you have to think about or that you think you need to think about when you are putting plants in a bed. So I hope I can simplify that for you and make it not so overwhelming. So that when you have some plants and a bed, you can just go for it instead of dithering and never actually getting anywhere. I think a lot of what stops people getting going with planting or perhaps expanding their planting is they get really bogged down in the planning. So hopefully we can make that a little bit simpler for you. So when you're thinking of starting a new bed or a new area of your veggie garden or starting altogether, there are a couple of important factors you need to think about before you can even think about your plants. The first is the soil. If you have a really terrible soil, you need to, and you don't have a means of improving it, like at the moment, it's really hard to get compost and things like that. You need to factor that in to how you choose your plants. And the other factor I feel is really important is how and what you're going to use in terms of your plants. So are you aiming for one big awesome tomato, or do you just want a continuous harvest of lots of green things? Are you really into your herbs? There's absolutely no point in spending time and energy planting things that you're not going to eat. So I think what's really nice though is if you have a balance of things that you know you're going to eat and then a few funky things thrown in just to keep things interesting and to experiment. So I have, after I've thought about my soil and my aims of use, I have two ways when I've got a new bed that's sitting in front of me, two ways of thinking about how I'm going to start my planting. The first is if I have a primary tenant for that space in mind. So by that, I mean the one plant that I really want to maximize the space for, or that I know is going to be in there for a long time. For example, in summer, tomatoes would be a primary tenant for a piece of the garden because they need trellises, they need really good soil, and I really need to concentrate on keeping pests away. So the tomatoes will be the main plant in that bed. And when I choose my companion plants, I'm going to think about things that are going to help that tomato and are going to grow well with the tomato. So that's actually a really simple way of planning a bed. What's your primary tenant? Another example there is a plant that's a perennial. So it's going to be in the bed for years and years and years. For example, something like asparagus, which you'll plant and will be in the bed for 10 years. So when you think about that, you plant your asparagus, you're like, cool, asparagus is going to be there for 10 years. Now, for those years, what can I also put in that bed that's going to help the asparagus and is also going to maximize my harvest for that area? So at the moment, I'm doing an experiment, which I don't know if it's going to work out or not. So the kind of known companion plants for asparagus are things like basil, coriander, lettuce, things with a shallow root system that's not going to interfere too much with the asparagus tubers that are growing underground. But I'm trying peas with my asparagus this winter because the asparagus is dying down. And it's a really prime spot in my garden. And I thought peas might be an interesting thing to use up the space vertically and hopefully also improve the soil over time. So that's where I've kind of thought around my prime tenant. Another way to do this is to create guilds. So if you're doing a lot of gardening, you'll create your own guilds that are easy to just to start with. So based around things that you want to plant often. So for example, one guild that I kind of reserve a space for every winter is brassicas. So that's cabbages, broccolis, kohlrabi is one of my favorite, alliums, which is all the onion family, and celery. I know they grow well together. I know that the brassicas need the onions to stop things like aphids attacking them. The celery grows really well, and they're all actually quite heavy feeding. So that's an area that I'll really improve the soil, and I know that those three things will grow together really well. So it's a no-brainer. I don't even have to really, I don't have to agonize about planting it. If I want my kohlrabi in that spot, I know that I also need to get some onions at least, or spring onions, to partner it with. Then I can add things like edible flowers and all sorts of herbs and things like that to bulk out the bed. So that's another thing that that if you're creating your own little easy go-to guilds, is to think about the diversity in your garden. So we're all home gardeners. We're not making huge monocultures, and it's much healthier to create diversity in your garden. And you can do that with creating little guilds like this, and also adding things like herbs and edible flowers. The more diversity you put into the garden, the less problems you're going to have with pests and things like that. So I told you about my brassica guild, which is one of my go-tos. Another go-to is a beetroot and lettuce guild. And with this one, one of the things I've thought about when I've put together this little group of plants, so it'll be beetroot and lettuce, and usually kohlrabi as well. I like to do things in threes. Is I've thought about the different rooting depths of the different plants, and also the way they use the canopy space. So beetroot it's got a swollen root, but it also takes up quite a bit of space with its leaves. But if you put a lettuce in when your beetroot is really small, the lettuce will take up that space before the beetroot gets big. So you can take out the lettuce and make more space for the beetroot. So that's a good way of using the space over time. Then again, kohlrabi doesn't take up a lot of underground space. So you can kind of puzzle them in together. And if I'm growing kohlrabi, I'll also put in some spring onions, which really don't take up very much above ground space at all. So it's all about thinking about what's going on above ground, what's going on below ground, both in terms of the structure of your plant and also the nutrient dynamics. So if everything's a heavy feeder, put them in a really good bed. If you've got things that are light feeders, you can have them in a poor bed. So people get a little bit confused when it comes to companion plants. There are lists and lists and lists of rules of what you plant together, what you can't plant together. And I think it's really easy to get bogged down in these do's and don'ts. Don't plant beans with beetroot, or do plant basil and tomatoes. And I think an important thing when you're planning or getting bogged down in your planning is just to think a little intelligently about why these rules might be in place. Also not to necessarily take the rules at face value. So for example, there might be a rule against planting two plants together because of a pest that doesn't occur here. So it's not a problem here. And the only way you're going to find these things out is if you start experimenting. This year, I broke the rules and I grew runner beans and beetroot together. And afterwards, looked up why runner beans and beetroot aren't supposed to be grown together. And it's because they stunt each other's growth. So that makes a lot of sense. So that's now on my list of things not to grow together. Another thing that was a positive was I grew strawberries and chives together just because I had two things that needed to be shoved in the same pot. And then in hindsight, found out that they're actually really good companions. But I looked up why. And it's because chives, because of their strong oniony smell, will repel a lot of pests. Also, they accumulate a lot of nutrients, and because they're so vigorous, you can cut them down often and use them as a chop and drop mulch. So chop and drop mulch is really useful for repelling pests, especially for things like brassicas, which are really attacked by aphids quite often. And the idea is when you prune your herbs, you just cut them up in smaller pieces and you drop them around as like kind of a green mulch around your plants that are getting attacked by a lot of pests. And so the smell repels the pests that are attracted to plants because of their smell. And in the case of chives, it also adds nutrients to the soil. So that was a real win for me. So now I know one of my rules is strawberries and chives, which is great. What is a good alternative to kohlrabi? From Emilu, any brassica? So I choose kohlrabi because they do really well and I think they look awesome in the garden. They're like aliens. My soil isn't good enough to support a brassica like broccoli or cauliflower. That just takes ages. For me, by the time they're flowering, the winds knock them over or the aphids have got to them because my soil drains so well they get too dry. I've found in my garden, which is still pretty poor sandy soil, and also I have water is a big problem here, so I don't do a lot of additional watering in winter. I like to grow cabbage, but I'll grow a baby cabbage because I know it'll take a lot quicker, so there's not so much time for pests to attack it. But I'll always want to, big rule for me is if I'm growing brassicas, I must grow some kind of allium with them to repel pests. It's also a good fit with the use of space. So I'm not sure how much time we're going to get here, but I'm going to be all technical about this and I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Right. So I'm quite a bit of a fan of Living Seeds, and I just thought I would show you. I love their seed packets because there's so much information here that it really, it's really worth your while to read all of that. If you order from them, there's a little key on all the different codes on what everything means. But basically, we've got here days to harvest, which is a really good planning tool. We've got whether you should direct seed or plant from seedlings. Although I don't follow this advice, I always start my beetroot in a seed tray first, just because of space and time. And then it shows the spacing as well. So this is really important. Here you can see there's space between rows, and this is space between individuals. I think that's how it works. So this, when you've got the size of your bed, this is a really good thing to think about, is the spacing. Now, with that, I'm going to tell you that this doesn't mean that there has to be 30 centimeters between this beetroot and any other plant. It's, if you think about your canopy and what's happening underground, it's going to be 30 centimeters between this beetroot and the next beetroot. So you can still squeeze stuff in between. That's not going to compete with either the canopy or the roots. So that's something that you will get with experience. Also, every time you pull something up your garden, have a look at the roots. See if they're really deep, or if they're really shallow, if they're really dense, or if it's got very few roots. It's going to tell you a lot about what you can plant together, and also how the plant interacts with the soil. So, for example, celery has incredible roots. They don't go very far, which is why they are really, really thirsty plants. But you have to water them like right at the plant. It doesn't help if you water it a meter away, it can't get to that water. So I'm going to show you an example bed, just so it's an example we can work through. This is a bed I'm doing for my mom. Hi, Mom. So as you can see, they've just started it, and it's really sandy soil. So let's hope that we can throw enough things in this hole to make it a good bed. But that's something that we're going to think about right from the beginning of planning this space, is that the soil is not likely to be absolutely premium. So we're going to grow things like root crops that don't need absolutely wonderful soil. I'm not going to stick a heavy feeding broccoli in here, not this year at least. So I have, this bed is about 1 meter deep by 3 meters long. It's in a bit of a curve. You can see there's access from both ends, which is nice, but at the back you'd have to be climbing over the rosemary bushes to get in there. So 1 meter is a little bit deep if you've only got access from one side. So we're going to keep that in mind when we are planning the planting. So I just did a little picture here. And the main aim for this bed is that they want to get continuous harvests as much as possible through the winter with the resources they have, and it's going to feed a couple of people. So what we've done is we've prioritized plants that will stay in place, but that you can harvest continuously. So here we have Swiss chard, the bright lights. They're actually really drought tolerant leafy greens. They're a lot tougher than something like a lettuce, and also you can continuously harvest them. If you look after them, they can be in the ground for 8 months, even a year. You can get, end up with Swiss chard palm trees, but they can go and go and go forever. So they're really good, and they would actually be my primary tenant in this bed. So there we have all our Swiss chard, and if we looked at our seed packet, the ideal distancing between them is 40 centimeters. So I've kind of stuck them in the middle here, hopefully with enough distance in between them. Then on the sides, so I put them in the middle of the bed so that they are easy to reach, right? So we can reach them from the top here. On the sides, I've put celery, which is another great thing for continuous harvests. You have to wait a little longer until you can get big harvests from the celery. But once it's going, if you look after it and you feed and water it quite a lot, you can continuously harvest from it until it gets too hot. So probably end of spring, it's going to start getting really bitter and woody, because the temperatures will just get too hot and it might get too dry in this well-draining soil. But as you can see, that's now accessible as well. It's quite a big plant. So I put it on the edges so it doesn't interfere with the sunshine for the other plants. And then it's also easily accessible. Then our other main tenant in this bed is beetroot, which is a really nice crop for a soil that isn't absolutely premium. If you put some bone meal in there, beetroots will do pretty well. And they will be harvested, of course, you just get a one-off harvest there unless you steal some leaves here and there. If this was my garden, I would mix up my beetroot and my Swiss chard, but because this is a plot that is designed for people who are new to gardening, I would rather plant things in organized rows so that they know, because beetroot and Swiss chard can look very similar, so that they know the beetroot are all in front, the Swiss chard are all behind them. Otherwise, people get really confused. So that's what's going to happen here. Also, the beetroot aren't going to get as tall as the Swiss chard, so they're not going to block the light. Sorry, this is north on this bottom end. Then at the very back of this bed, because it's quite a deep bed and it's going to be quite difficult to reach over to the back, we're not going to waste the space. We're going to put something there that can just be planted once, maybe thinned out once or twice, and then just left and forgotten about, probably until the end of winter when you're going to turn over this whole bed anyway. So here I've put a strip of, it can be parsnips or carrots, not both, because they don't like growing together because their roots compete. And we can just sow that once, climb over the rosemary once or twice at the beginning to thin them out, and then just leave them and forget about them, so that we're not wasting that space at the back of the bed. So those are our main crops that we're getting. We could leave it at that. That could be fine. But because we're going to try and maximize the space, we can also squeeze all sorts of other things in. So because we are going to plant seedlings, but they're going to be quite small, there's going to be a lot of space in between them. We're in the beginning of this bed's life as a food producing area. So what we're going to do is, in between all those small seedlings, we're going to plant things that are either quick to harvest, so they'll be harvested before our main crops need the space, or they don't take up a lot of space. So we've got lettuces and radishes. Radish we'll sow from seed. Those will quickly come out in 30 to 40 days, depending on how patient you are. Lettuces we'll put in as seedlings, so they've already got a head start, and those will also come out before the beetroot and the Swiss chard need the space. Then also spring onions are a really good companion for carrots, and they really take up very little space. They will be in there for a little bit longer, but they're skinny things. They're not going to block the light from anything. They're not going to compete for very much space underground with their roots. So they're a really nice thing to stick in. Also, usually when you plant spring onion seedlings, it's quite a clump. So you can get a continuous harvest by harvesting the spring onions on the outside of the clump as smaller plants, letting the ones in the middle get bigger. So you could probably harvest them, over the space of a month, even 2, depending on how quickly they're growing. So that's another extra harvest you can get out. But by the time your beetroot and your Swiss chard need the space, all of these little fillers are going to be out of the bed. I've also put in this bed borage, which is my edible flower of choice for winter. You could also use calendula. We've got borage seedlings at the moment, so that's what we're going to use. So if I just go back to the first plan, this is fulfilling a couple of functions in this bed. It's, for one thing, an absolutely beautiful flower, beautiful blue flower. And it just makes, I think it makes it so much nicer to have some different colors in the bed, especially because this is a bed for people who are new to food gardening. So it brings them a little bit of joy. The other great thing is this flower is edible. It has a little cucumbery taste, so it's lovely as a garnish. So this plant is edible as well as ornamental. The third use for borage is that they have incredibly deep roots. So they're going to bring nutrients up from much lower than where all these other plants are accessing nutrients and store them in the leaves. Borage also gets quite out of control. It's quite a sprawling plant when it gets going. So the reason I put it on the edge is it can sprawl over onto the path, but also it can be pruned regularly, and the leaves can be used to make a liquid fertilizer. So they'll prune the leaves maybe every month or so, stick them in a barrel with some water, let it rot down until it smells terrible. Then it's going to be a great liquid fertilizer to add back to this bed and give everything else a boost. So it's fulfilling a whole lot of functions. It's not just a pretty flower. Another thing we could do here is we could, if we started having a pest problem, sorry, let me just see. Yes, Emilu. If you have a pest problem, you could use the rosemary plants as a chop and drop mulch. So I spoke before about using chives as a chop and drop mulch. You can do exactly the same with rosemary. So you can see the rosemary plants here are quite big, and they'll be getting extra water in winter and maybe have a growth spurt. So you could cut them back, cut the leaves into small pieces and just drop them around your plants as a mulch. You could also, there's space in between these rosemary plants, and you could grow other companion plants. Things like nasturtiums are really great as well as an edible plant. You can eat both the leaves and the flowers. They might get out of control, though they also are quite weedy, but they're also really great to add to the compost heap as well, because they accumulate a lot of nutrients. Calendula is another thing that you could add in between these rosemary plants for some color. And the flowers are edible as well as being used in medicinal purposes. So a lot of people make like a hand salve out of them. So that's really great. They also seem to attract aphids. So if you have a look at them and you see aphids, then you know you need to do something about what's going on in your garden. So that's just a quick example of how you could make the most out of a bed and get continuous harvests. So we've put lettuces and radishes in between everything here, and there's nothing saying that you can't put a second round of radishes in, or even lettuces if you've got seedlings on the go, before you get your main harvest, or even after you've taken your beetroot out. So these beetroot might take, because we're putting them in as seedlings, they might take 2 months, maybe longer, because it's going to be midwinter, to mature, to get to a nice size. But after that, if we've got lettuce seedlings or even more beetroot seedlings, we can put them in for a second round, remembering that we'll be retaining the celery, the borage, and the Swiss chard, and the parsnips or carrots will be hanging out the back. So that's how you can just get a continuous harvest out of this bed as a winter bed until spring comes, and then we can start to change our mind about what we want. Do wild garlic chives work the same as normal chives? Sorry, I didn't see that question in the beginning, Emmylou. Yeah, wild garlic does really well in repelling aphids. In fact, in the past, we've done an experiment where we were growing broccoli in a place that was quite dry. And the wild garlic was actually a hedge of one of the beds. So we planted broccoli away from the wild garlic, and then we planted broccoli like right in the bed that was absolutely surrounded by wild garlic. No aphids on that one at all. But with these companion plants that deter pests, it doesn't help if there's just one small plant, right? It has to actually be quite a considerable amount. So like a hedge of wild garlic, a big clump or 3 or 4 of chives amongst your broccoli. With tomatoes, one of the things is, one of the kind of urban legends is grow basil next to your tomatoes to improve the taste of basil, of the tomatoes. And someone actually did a scientific study on this, and found that you have to grow, I think it was 20 full-grown basil plants around one tomato plant to make any kind of difference to the taste. So it's something worth thinking about when you plan and you're planting. Okay, so that was the end of my planned talk. We can open it up to questions now. We're only going to have about 10 more minutes for this meeting, but we can start up again if Zoom cuts us off and there's more questions. So fire away. No questions. Okay, so because we have got a little more time, I'm going to ask you guys a question and you can all answer me. What is your favorite thing in the winter garden? Mine is peas, which are still not very successful in growing because I have lots of snails. So give me your favorite things and maybe we can find some examples of good companions for them.
I really like Swiss chard because it's pretty.
You know, I get all the different colors. If I buy the seedlings at a nursery, I go through all the 6-packs to make sure I get the full range, and then I plant them in patterns. But the thing is, stuff like that, like I like to grow the purple kohlrabi, the colorful Swiss chard. If I was successful with broccoli, I would want the purple broccoli. Actually growing stuff with all those different colors does add nutrients. Because they are different compounds that create those colors that are actually really good for you. So it's not just being frivolous.
Yeah. I think we should do a talk on pests. I'm just putting it out there. I think we should have like one talk just on all the different pests with pictures, because we often ask each other.
What is this? What is that?
I think that would be a good one. That could
take up a whole day.
Yes.
I think my main pests in winter are snails, and that's why I struggle with peas. So this is another thing that you can do is if you have a plant that you're growing for the first time, or you're not sure where it's going to be happiest, get quite a few seedlings or seeds, however you're starting things, and grow them in different areas of the garden. So grow, 3 here, 3 over there, 3 in that shadier spot, 3 in that sunnier spot, and then you can find out for the next season where they did best, and note that down. So I think there's, for me, one of the most important things when you are starting off gardening, or even if you've been gardening for a long time, is to garden intelligently. So instead of just blindly following rules and what a book told you to do, actually every garden is different. So if you just take, the extra 2 minutes of concentration to remember where things did better, what combinations worked better, you don't have to get bogged down and totally confused about all these rules that are out there on the internet. You make your own rules for your own garden. So garden intelligently, I think, is the way to do it.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. The one thing is beetroot. I always feel bad not to use the leaves. Can one cook them easily with spinach? Or?
Oh yeah. Look, I use beetroot leaves. I use them raw. The smaller ones are really nice raw in a salad. And then when I harvest the beetroot itself, you can chop up those leaves and stir fry them, cook them like spinach. Remember that beetroot and Swiss chard are so closely related that they cross-pollinate. They're basically the same thing. It's just that beetroot have been bred to make these wonderful bulbs that we eat, and Swiss chard has been bred to make a leafier leaf. So I read somewhere that the nutrients in the beetroot leaf actually outdo the nutrients in the root that we usually eat. So eat all parts of the leaf. It's all good.
And another question, I heard that the leaves of the sweet potatoes are very nice and very good. And I got them in my garden, but I also got efeu, what apparently is poison. So I'm always afraid to touch the leaves because I could cook the wrong ones.
Yeah. And I think
maybe if I get the sweet potato out and it got leaves on, then it's safe.
Yeah, I think so. I think or to clear the morning glory away from the sweet potato completely, so you don't confuse them. Yeah, I haven't tried sweet potato leaves. I never get enough.
Yeah, I haven't checked on them yet. But anyway, thanks very much. That was my question.
I was wondering about sunlight, and in winter, how much sunlight, because obviously, I mean, summer we have a lot of, how many hours? I mean, that's another question always in terms of the different vegetables, is that they need, so is there sort of a basic roots need maybe this much and fruit needs more, and one can sort of plan it?
A simple way to think about it is if you're growing it for the leaf, it doesn't need as much sun. If you're growing it for a root or a fruit, it needs maximum sun that you can give it. Having said that, I have grown beetroot successfully in kind of semi-shade. They will grow slower though. So that's another thing you can do, is if you've got a whole lot of seedlings that are ready at the same time, is you can grow them in a gradient throughout your garden of sunlight hours, so that you get that's how you can continue your harvest with just one planting effort.
Perfect.
Another thing I read that I think is really useful is, because I never have enough seedlings to carry this out, but if you have a whole lot of seedlings, if you keep them in the 6-packs or trays or whatever you bought them in, you can plant, say 4 this week, 4 the next week, 4 the next week. The longer they're in, while they're in the smaller pots, it's going to stunt their growth. So it's going to keep, so you can get it seems a little bit cruel, but you can get a continuous harvest out of, kind of one tray of seedlings that were all started at the same time, just by keeping them in the small pots for a little bit longer. I know the thing with beetroot is that you're supposed to, because it's a root crop, you're supposed to direct seed it. But because I've got a snail problem, it is a lot easier for me to put them in seedling trays first. It does. I think you also need to remember when you're planning a bed and you're looking at days to harvest on your seed packet or whatever. If you've planted something out, so if you've transplanted it, it does. The plants do take a little while to get used to the new environment, so it sometimes might set back the days to harvest by 10 days, or depending on how gently you've planted them. So, if you thought that those beetroot were supposed to be ready this week, but they just don't look big enough yet, it might be because they got a little bit a setback when you transplanted them.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. I've got less than a minute left. So I think, which nursery do you recommend for the best seedlings? Yeah, so I'm going to plug Anna here. So Breaking Ground Organics, who Anna is part of our group. She grows incredible seedlings. I think you have to, I don't know if you can get seedlings from her at the moment. I don't know if she's allowed to sell. But once she's back on you can make an appointment with her and go and check things out. Otherwise, Earthworks in Hout Bay doesn't have a great range. If I really want to get food plant seedlings, I go to Ferndale in Constantia. It really has the best range of edible seedlings. Hearts in Ottery is also great, but that's a bit far from Hout Bay. Okay.
I just want to add.
Yeah.
Sorry. I just want to add. Hello, everyone. Anna is open. She's not actually there herself, but she's got someone there, and you just have to WhatsApp her, book what you want, and they'll have it ready for you, and you can do an EFT. Because we bought some stuff that way. Yes.
Oh, fantastic!
But she doesn't have a huge range right now, but maybe find out what she has.
Yeah.
So what's her name? Anna.
Anna Steenkamp, I think.
Yeah. She got married.
I'll put the link on the website.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, so that's Breaking Ground Organics, which is really nice because it's right here in Hout Bay. Okay, I think we're going to get cut off. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope that was useful. So oh, yeah, Soil for Life is also great.